Hi, it's Steve. Today we'd like to show you how to change the lint filter cover on your dryer. It's a really easy repair. Let me show you how we do it. Now before we begin this repair, the first thing we'll need to do is to disconnect power to the dryer. So either pull it far enough forward that you can unplug it, or locate the electrical panel and turn off the appropriate breaker, or remove the appropriate fuses. Once we've done that, we can start the repair. Now that we've disconnected the power, we'll need to pull the dryer far enough forward that we can access the back of the dryer to remove two retaining screws that secure the main top to the cabinet. So using either a Phillips screwdriver or a 10mm socket, we'll remove those two screws. Now next, we're just going to grasp both sides of that main top, pull it back about 1 inch until it's disengaged from the control panel housing. We can lift up on it and set it aside. Now with the main top removed, our next step is to remove the front console. Before we lift that out of the way, we're just going to reach inside and release that wire harness from the restraint. That will allow the harness to go through that opening. Now to remove the control panel housing, we simply need to lift up along the back of it and release these plastic tabs. Now once we've released all of the tabs, we're going to gently tilt it forward while lifting up on it to disengage some hooks at the front. Once we've released the hooks on the bottom of that control panel, we can lift it away. You'll see the 4 hooks that fit down into openings in the front panel. At this point, we're going to disconnect the 2 harness connectors to that control panel. We'll need to depress the locking tabs and then separate the harness connector. And then we'll set the control panel housing aside. Now our next step will be to open up the dryer door. And we're going to remove these 2 screws that secure that lint filter housing to the front panel. These are number 2 Phillips head screws, and they have a built-in washer on them. You can then close the door up. Now our next step will be to remove that front panel door assembly. We'll begin by taking 4 screws out across the top of the panel. It's also held in place with 2 little spring clips, so you may need a flat blade screwdriver to release those. So we'll begin by removing the screws. Be sure to support that door and front panel assembly as you remove the last screw. Those spring clips should hold it in place, but just in case they don't. Now next we're going to pull forward on that front panel and just depress those spring clips. I'll just pull it slightly forward, and then we're going to reach in and disconnect a wire harness. Simply grasp the connector to the door switch and pull it free. Then we'll tilt the front panel down and lift it away from the base. And we'll set that aside. Now with the front panel removed, our next step is to remove the screws that secure this housing. There's one on either side in those recessed holes, and another one on the bottom. Again, they're number 2 Phillips head screws. And now we'll go to the outside of the bulkhead and remove some screws there as well. Now to do this repair, we find it easier if you remove this inlet duct assembly. It's held in place with 3 screws around the perimeter. Remove the lint filter, simply pull up on it and set it aside. And then just pull out on that housing and pull downward on it to remove it. And we'll set that aside. Now next we're going to remove this single screw. And now that assembly is free, we're going to just lift up on it and tilt it back. Our next step will be to disconnect the 2 wires that go to the sensor bars. Now, without putting any strain on those 2 wires, just tilt that sideways. We'll use a pair of needle nose pliers and come up in underneath, and then gently pry off those wire terminals. Now we can lift that assembly away and complete the repair. Now, with the assembly removed from the dryer, if the old door is still in place, you'll need to remove it. To do so, we're going to flex it in the center and disengage it from that little hook. Simply push up on it. Now, with it disengaged in the middle, we're simply going to continue to push up on that and disengage either end. Be sure to capture the spring to use on the new cover. Now we'll begin by installing that spring on the left side. Make sure the right angled portion of that spring sits underneath the cover. Now we're going to fit that down into the opening and insert that pin through that hole. That will require putting tension on the spring. Now, with one end inserted, we're going to just gently separate the opposite end. There's a little locking tab in this notch. Just separate that slightly. Keep pressure on the door to hold the spring end in. I'm going to flex it. And allow that other pin to fit into the corresponding hole. And while holding that door upward, we'll squeeze the 2 halves together again. We need to make sure that the 2 stops fit into those slotted openings. Then we need to snap the center portion of that hinge into place. Again, make sure both the tabs on each end are locked in place and that the door can open and close with the spring tension. And now we're ready to put that assembly back into the dryer. We'll first of all reconnect the wire harness to the sensor bars. So using our needle nose pliers, we'll grasp those connectors. You may need to tilt that forward as you insert those terminals onto the end of the sensor bars, and then just tilt it back and make sure that they're firmly in place. And we'll drop it down into the opening. Make sure it lines up, and then we'll put the single screw through the front. Now we'll line up the inlet duct assembly. And we'll secure it with the screws. We can insert our lint filter. And then we'll reconnect the 3 screws on the inside of the drum. Now, when attaching the 2 outside screws, just make sure that we squeeze that assembly tight up against the bulkhead. And tighten it securely. And lastly, we'll install the single one in the center. And now we're ready to put the front panel on. Now when reinstalling that front panel, we need to make sure that the 3 slotted openings in the bottom of the panel fit over the 3 hooks on the base of the cabinet. Then we'll tilt that panel up into place, reconnect the harness to the door switch. Then press it up into place and allow those 2 spring clips to hold it in position. Then we'll reinstall the screws across the top. Next, we'll open up the door and reinstall the 2 screws through the front. And these are the screws that have the flat washers already installed on them. And don't over tighten these. You don't want to damage the painted finish or strip the screws in the plastic housing. We can then close that door up. We're now ready to put the control panel back in place. We'll begin by reconnecting the harnesses. Make sure the tabs engage. Now we need to make sure that the 2 sets of hooks on the bottom fit into those 2 sets of holes. As well, there are 2 tabs in the center that fit into corresponding holes on top of the front panel. So we'll engage the bottom ones first. Make sure they line up. You'll have to lift up just slightly to allow the center ones to line up. And then you can push it down into place, and then we'll snap it across the back to lock it into those tabs. Make sure all of the tabs across the top are engaged. And we'll also pull that harness back through the opening and fit it into the restraint. And now we're ready to put the main top on. Now when installing the top panel, we need to ensure that these rectangular openings in the front edge of that top panel engage the clips on the back of the console. As well, there's a little cutout on the bottom edge of that top, and it has to sit back far enough that it will slide in under this hook on that support bracket on both sides. So we'll place it evenly side to side, about 1 inch back from the edge of that control panel, and pull it forward. Make sure it engages all of those tabs, as well as the hooks on the top of the cabinet. It should be flush all along the sides. And then we'll install the 2 retaining screws at the back. And we tighten those both securely, and then we'll push the dryer back into position. We're now ready to push the dryer back into place, reconnect the power, and your repair is complete.